Consider this truthfully. What occurs with the majority of men following marriage? Their circle of friends diminishes or vanishes completely. Their personal interests are labeled as selfish unless they benefit the family structure. Their leisure time becomes consumed by domestic responsibilities and familial duties. Their finances transition from personal assets to joint resources, with the woman frequently managing the expenditures. This pattern isn't coincidental, it's intentional. Women naturally recognize that a man's commitment to the family strengthens when his external alternatives weaken. With fewer outside options available, he'll invest more resources into preserving the relationship. Gradually, decision by decision, his autonomous existence gets systematically eliminated until he finds himself both psychologically and financially confined. The brilliance of this arrangement lies in how it weaponizes a man's own principles against him. His aspiration to be a dependable partner, a steady provider, and a devoted father. These honorable motivations transform into the very restraints that confine him. He participates in his own confinement because objecting seems self-centered and irresponsible. Carl Jung wrote about the terror of complete self-acceptance. Yet for husbands, the true terror lies in acknowledging how thoroughly they've been tamed. Examine the phrases we commonly use. Ball and chain, getting hitched, taking the plunge. Even our everyday language betrays a subconscious recognition that marriage signifies a sacrifice of autonomy, not an achievement of equal partnership. But the situation becomes truly sinister here. The system doesn't merely take advantage of men. It's constructed to make them feel thankful for being taken advantage of. The notion of happy wife, happy life isn't traditional wisdom. It's mental conditioning that instructs men to place a woman's emotional condition above their own requirements, aspirations, and welfare. This establishes a core power disparity, where one individual's contentment becomes the central objective, while the other individual's contentment becomes dependent on fulfilling that objective. It's not collaboration, it's subjugation with superior branding. Schopenhauer noted that a man can only be authentic when alone. Marriage methodically removes the privacy and autonomy that enable men to preserve their genuine identity. They slowly transform into what their spouse requires them to be, instead of who they truly are. The metamorphosis occurs so incrementally that most men remain unaware until the process completes itself. They begin making minor concessions, canceling plans with friends to maintain peace, selecting her preferred dining establishment to prevent disagreement, yielding to her perspective on social arrangements. Each concession appears sensible individually, but together they constitute a total relinquishment of personal control. Simultaneously, women's conduct in marriage adheres to a foreseeable sequence that exposes the fundamental biological conditioning. Throughout the dating period, they enhance their attractiveness. Regular intimacy, common interests, few requirements, maximum accommodation. Following the securing of commitment, the dynamic slowly inverts. Intimacy transforms into compensation for proper conduct rather than a manifestation of attraction. Common interests become irrelevant unless they advance family objectives. Requirements escalate while accommodation declines. The woman who once eagerly pleased now expects to be pleased. This isn't deliberate manipulation, it's evolutionary conditioning. Women possess biological programming to obtain resources and commitment, then refine the situation for optimal advantage. The man who fails to comprehend this programming becomes its casualty. Here's the harsh truth that most men decline to acknowledge. Your wife's affection is essentially conditional. It's founded on your usefulness, not your inherent value. The instant you cease delivering value, whether through financial setbacks, medical issues, or simply becoming overly predictable, that affection starts disappearing. Divorce data confirms this assertion. Women commence 70 to 80% of divorces, and they initiate them when the cost-benefit evaluation of the marriage moves in their direction. They don't depart because they're dissatisfied. They depart because they can secure superior conditions elsewhere or have obtained maximum benefit from the present situation. The family court apparatus completes the exploitation by guaranteeing that even divorce doesn't liberate the man from his resource extraction responsibilities. Spousal support, child support, and property division ensure that he continues funding a family arrangement he can no longer participate in or gain from. But the situation becomes genuine psychological combat here. Contemporary marriage doesn't simply exploit men financially. It annihilates them mentally by assaulting their core sense of identity and meaning. The husband discovers that his ideas, emotions, and wishes carry less weight than preserving domestic tranquility. His position becomes responsive instead of initiative-taking. He functions to resolve problems, deliver solutions, and absorb emotional weight. This generates what psychologists term learned helplessness, a state where continuous exposure to unmanageable stress makes people cease attempting to escape, even when escape becomes feasible. The husband stops advocating for his needs because experience has demonstrated that opposition only generates additional problems. He acquires what I term domestic Stockholm syndrome, aligning with his captor's objectives and protecting the system that exploits him. He convinces himself that sacrifice represents love, that his discomfort reflects selfishness, that authentic men prioritize family regardless of personal expense. The most damaging element of this conditioning is its societal reinforcement. Entertainment glorifies the family man who relinquishes everything for his spouse and offspring. Faith traditions instruct that selflessness constitutes virtue, and that men should cherish their wives, as Christ cherished the church through absolute self-sacrifice. Even fellow men strengthen this conditioning. Husbands cannot confess the actuality of their circumstances without recognizing their own psychological surrender. Consequently, they maintain the illusion that marriage equals partnership while experiencing the reality that it equals servitude. If you're identifying these sequences in your personal life or relationships, if this examination is exposing uncomfortable realities about contemporary marriage, I urge you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your interaction assists in guaranteeing that these discussions persist, that men begin comprehending these psychological mechanisms that influence their relationships. The algorithms respond to your involvement, and your backing enables these perspectives to reach the men who require them most. The calamity isn't that women capitalize on these mechanisms. It's that men remain so unprepared for them. Society instructs men to be providers and defenders, without instructing them to defend themselves from the very individuals they're providing for. Here's what nobody informs young men about marriage. The instant you designate a woman as your principal source of contentment, confirmation, and purpose, you've already been defeated. You've transferred your psychological independence to someone whose biological conditioning prioritizes her requirements over yours. This doesn't render women malicious, it renders them female. Their conduct adheres to foreseeable sequences because those sequences succeeded throughout millions of years of human development. The women who could effectively obtain resources from men reproduced more successfully than those who couldn't. However, evolution didn't condition women to prioritize men's psychological welfare or personal satisfaction. It conditioned them to guarantee survival and reproductive benefit. Contemporary marriage provides them legal and social instruments to advance these objectives with extraordinary efficiency. The man who comprehends this actuality stops interpreting female conduct personally and begins responding tactically. He acknowledges that marriage isn't concerning affection, it's concerning influence, and the individual with more alternatives consistently possesses more influence. Schopenhauer wrote that all satisfaction, or what's typically termed happiness, is genuinely and fundamentally always negative, exclusively and never positive. He grasped that authentic satisfaction originates not from obtaining what you desire from others, but from not requiring anything from others to feel whole. This principle demolishes the core assumption of contemporary marriage, that contentment derives from partnership and collective life objectives. The man who requires marriage to feel satisfied has already relinquished his authority. The man who regards marriage as discretionary preserves his independence. But most men commit their critical mistake here. They assume they can negotiate or merit their escape from these mechanisms through superior conduct. They believe if they simply communicate more proficiently, deliver more resources, or become more appealing, the core power arrangement will shift in their direction. This resembles attempting to negotiate with gravity. You're not addressing conscious selections. You're addressing biological mandates that function beneath conscious awareness. Women don't select to refine their relationships for maximum advantage any more than men select to find youthful, fertile women appealing. The sole successful strategy is declining to participate in regulations that guarantee your failure. Here's the concealed reality that accomplished men comprehend, but never publicly recognize. The instant you become essential to a woman's lifestyle, you become expendable as an individual. She ceases perceiving you as a person with requirements, aspirations, and ambitions. You transform into a function: provider, defender, problem resolver, emotional absorber. This operational relationship might resemble marriage externally, but it's actually refined enslavement with intermittent intimate advantages. The man delivers labor and resources, while the woman administers the household and regulates access to affection. It's productive, but it's not collaboration. The psychological burden of this configuration explains why husbands perish earlier, experience elevated depression rates, and frequently appear like remnants of their previous selves. They're not experiencing typical life pressure. They're experiencing persistent psychological exploitation camouflaged as affection. Yet society won't recognize this actuality because the complete economic structure depends on men's readiness to relinquish their personal satisfaction for familial responsibilities. The man who prioritizes his personal contentment over familial obligation threatens the social structure that necessitates male sacrifice to operate. This explains why men who challenge marriage are characterized as self-centered, undeveloped, or commitment-averse. The system cannot endure candid examination, so it employs disgrace and social coercion to obstruct men from reasoning lucidly about the exchange they're initiating. Here's where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes transformative. The most secure approach to not being extremely unfortunate is not anticipating to be extremely content. When implemented to relationships, this signifies not anticipating marriage to deliver contentment, satisfaction, or unconditional affection. When you remove these anticipations, you remove the disillusionment that devastates most men's psychological welfare. You commence assessing marriage like any alternative agreement founded on conditions, expenses, and advantages, instead of sentiments and social anticipations. You question yourself: what am I obtaining from this configuration? What am I relinquishing? And does this exchange benefit my extended interests? Most men never pose these inquiries because they've been conditioned to assume that affection surpasses practical considerations. However, affection diminishes, sentiments transform, and individuals' requirements develop. The marriage agreement remains obligatory regardless of anyone's feelings about it. The man who approaches relationships tactically instead of sentimentally preserves his authority throughout the engagement. He doesn't relinquish his autonomy anticipating to obtain loyalty reciprocally. He doesn't sacrifice his identity anticipating to be valued for it. He doesn't designate someone else accountable for his contentment and subsequently harbor resentment when they unavoidably fail to fulfill expectations. This tactical perspective necessitates cultivating what Schopenhauer termed the craft of not being misled. You must master recognizing the distinction between what women articulate and what they genuinely respond to. They profess to desire sensitive, emotionally accessible men who prioritize their sentiments, but their conduct consistently compensates men who prioritize their personal mission and preserve emotional autonomy. Observe how women treat men in their social environments. The individual who abandons everything when she contacts gets exploited. The individual who's occasionally unavailable because he possesses significant obligations gets pursued. The individual who solicits her endorsement for his determinations forfeits her regard. The individual who formulates determinations and welcomes her participation preserves her interest. This isn't deliberate deception on women's behalf. They authentically assume they desire what they articulate they desire. However, their subconscious conditioning responds to entirely different indicators. They're attracted to capability, stimulated by autonomy, and disinterested in predictability. Nevertheless, they'll condemn men for exhibiting these precise characteristics when it accommodates their immediate emotional requirements. The contemporary man must traverse this contradiction by comprehending that women's conscious aspirations frequently contradict their unconscious conditioning. You cannot attend to what they articulate they desire. You must examine what genuinely produces attraction and regard in their conduct. Instead, he constructs an existence so captivating that partnership becomes discretionary instead of essential. He cultivates objectives so absorbing that he's not reliant on relationships for significance. He becomes so comfortable with isolation that companionship must authentically contribute value instead of occupying emotional deficiencies. This psychological autonomy is appealing specifically because it's uncommon. Most men are so frantic for confirmation and connection that they'll acknowledge nearly any conditions to obtain it. The man who doesn't require anything from others becomes psychologically attractive. The scarcity concept functions mercilessly in romantic mechanisms. When you're perpetually accessible, consistently accommodating, and infinitely obliging, you indicate minimal worth and restricted alternatives. Women's evolutionary conditioning interprets this conduct as genetic inadequacy and social insignificance. Regardless of how considerably they consciously value your attempts, their subconscious attraction mechanisms deactivate in reaction to your neediness. Contemplate how this manifests in contemporary dating culture. The men who struggle most are those who designate women as the focus of their universe from the initial engagement. They message instantly, consistently accept plans, reorganize their schedules without solicitation, and demonstrate through every action that this woman constitutes the most significant element in their existence. This conduct activates biological warnings in women's psychology. If he possesses nothing else occurring, if he's so enthusiastic to please, if he's this accessible this rapidly, what's deficient with him? Why aren't other women contending for his attention? Why doesn't he possess significant obligations? Simultaneously, the men who produce compulsive attraction are those who regard dating as one interesting dimension of an already satisfying existence. They possess missions that signify more than any particular woman. They possess standards that they preserve regardless of social coercion. They possess boundaries that they implement even when it generates temporary disagreement. Women don't consciously select to be attracted to this conduct. Their biology formulates the selection for them. They discover themselves contemplating the man who doesn't consistently message back instantly, questioning what he's executing when he's not accessible, laboring to obtain attention that isn't freely provided. This generates a psychological mechanism where the woman commences investing more exertion into the relationship than she's obtaining. She commences pursuing instead of being pursued. She commences demonstrating her value instead of assessing his. This position reversal is psychologically addictive for women because it reflects the natural courtship sequences that their biology anticipates. But here's the contradiction that confuses most men. The less you require relationships, the superior your relationships become. The less you pursue, the more you're pursued. The less you invest sentimentally, the more others become invested in you. This isn't game manipulation or deception, it's fundamental human psychology. Individuals value what's scarce and reject what's plentiful. Your attention, duration, and emotional investment become more valuable when they're not freely accessible to everyone. The marriage trap operates by persuading men that scarcity constitutes selfishness and that boundless accessibility confirms affection. However, boundless accessibility doesn't confirm affection. It confirms desperation, and desperation represents the contrary of appealing. Women's biological conditioning is constructed to evaluate men's psychological capability through various manifestations of coercion and manipulation. The man who consistently fails these evaluations by prioritizing her sentiments over his personal principles forfeits her regard and attraction. The man who succeeds in these evaluations by preserving his boundaries and priorities obtains her continuing investment and exertion. She doesn't consciously select to regard capability over inadequacy. Her biology formulates this selection for her. This explains why nice guys finish last isn't merely a resentful expression. It's a biological principle. Niceness indicates genetic inadequacy, emotional neediness, and absence of alternatives. These characteristics activate disgust instead of attraction in women's evolutionary conditioning. But here's the essential distinction most men overlook. Being capable doesn't signify being harsh. Being autonomous doesn't signify being apathetic. Being selective doesn't signify being abusive. The psychologically independent man can be compassionate without being inadequate, charitable without being exploited, and affectionate without forfeiting himself in the procedure. He provides from abundance instead of neediness, which renders his contributions authentically valuable instead of burdensome. This metamorphosis necessitates eliminating the component of yourself that solicits confirmation from others. You must become so internally whole that external endorsement becomes irrelevant to your perception of self-value. You must cultivate objectives so captivating that relationship conflict appears insignificant by comparison. The expedition to this psychological independence is severe.